Okay, so now what we're having right now is now there's starting to be a conflict, and we find this in Acts, and we also find it if you review, if you read certain letters of the Christian scriptures, like Galatians and James and Acts and Galatians, you'll notice that there's a problem now starting to happen early on. We guesstimate, and I'm saying we meaning other scholars, guesstimate that this sort of thing is happening around 50, 60 AD, maybe 65 AD. We're not sure because we know based on the texts that if it was later than 65 AD or CE, that that in the writings something as great as the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem would have been mentioned, and that's how we're basing the evidence. No one would ever say, everyone will say, well, after 9/11, for example. So it was a pretty big deal, especially amongst Jews, all Jews, regardless of whether they were Alexandrian, Pharisaical, Sadducean, or what have you. So there's obviously a problem starting to happen. Certain Jews, as you know, the Silk Road and a lot of the trades of the time were done by Middle Eastern people, primarily Jews. They, what we can guesstimate, of course this is all guesstimation in this regard, of how this all transpired, was that Jews left Jerusalem and went into Rome and to other places, and they would enter into the synagogues, as was the practice on Shabbat, and they would find groups of people acting or behaving or even practicing Judaism in a way that is not consistent with the way Judaism is being practiced at this present time, between 45 and 65 CE. And there's a famous calling back of Paul and the Council of Jerusalem, which consisted of John, Peter, and James being the Beit Din, as we discussed earlier. This was a practice that started to happen because people didn't trust the the authorities of the Sanhedrin because of their ties with the Roman government. So there's obviously a back and forth going on between the center, where this religion is, or I won't call it, the sect of Judaism is going on right now and holding itself, and what's happening in the far reaches. It is not unusual that Jews at this time were very pro proselytization and conversion. This was going on for quite a while, and it pretty much abruptly stops at 70 AD, and we're going to get into that. That's quite complicated, but suffice it to say, Judaism as a practice and associated practices become illegal after the destruction of the temple. So we know that all this stuff is going on during the free period, during the liberal period, where the Roman government has no problem with Judaism or its related sects. So finally, we have the calling back of Paul standing before judgment by the Beit Din, or Beis Din, if you're Ashkenazi, as I am, this judgment seat, and there's a back and forth. Now, I won't go into details of that because that also goes into theology, and I would like to try to stay strict to history. So there's obviously a conflict. The conflict continues on between the more liberal Paul, trying to accept as many people in and trying to propagate Judaism as he sees it in many different places. Paul is very clear. He's not trying to propagate another religion. He doesn't see it as a new religion. He sees it as Judaism, but he also sees his theology changing and morphing and being more acceptive, more liberal than the very orthodox, very strict James. And this is an aspect you have to understand about Judaism. There's an old joke, I've probably said it a couple of times before. When you have 3 rabbis in a room, you have 9 opinions. The argument here is that at the point everyone agrees that we have to return to the temple was the anchoring point for Judaism. All else fails, you do come back to the temple, you do give your sacrifices and so forth. So that's why it wasn't so crazy, and people have been doing this since probably the times of the Maccabees, where some Jews away from Israel were much more liberal than the ones inside Israel. What causes the big shakeup is when finally the temple is destroyed, and now we, meaning Judaism, has to anchor itself with itself, since it doesn't have that center of the temple in Jerusalem. Finally, in this section, because we're going to go into multiple sections when it comes to the cascading effect of the destruction of the temple by Vespasian. You have to understand that just like Buddhism, and I'm using Buddhism as an example because it's a very good example, when Buddha started in India, the people who are Buddhists in India did not believe him as a god. But when Buddhism started to leave the country and go into China and Japan and so forth, it kept morphing. Zen Buddhism is nothing like Chinese Buddhism, and Chinese Buddhism is nothing like Hindu Buddhism. So, using that example, the farther away you get from the center, the more diluted it becomes. So the question will have to be, where do you want to start? Do you want to start from the center, or do you want to start from the outside? This is the decision you have to make. So, as I said, now there's a conflict between the two sects of Judaism, and now comes the horrible destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.